Um, I know that I've always been attracted to cars. In fact, it was a super attraction. People have been asking me the same question for decades. Phil, who was the greatest Formula One driver you ever knew? They usually expect one name, maybe the driver with the most championships, maybe the one with the most victories. That's how history likes to tell these stories. My answer has always been different. The five drivers I'm about to talk about weren't simply the greatest. They were the men I admired most. Admiration isn't built on statistics, it's built on respect. Um, it's earned by watching someone do things behind the wheel that force you to rethink what is possible. Sometimes it comes from sharing a garage. Sometimes it comes from chasing the same piece of asphalt at 200 miles an hour. Sometimes it comes from watching a man carry himself with dignity when nobody else could. I was fortunate enough to race during an extraordinary era in Formula One in the 1950s and 1960s. Was filled with remarkable drivers, remarkable personalities, and extraordinary courage. Every race weekend felt like a gathering of men who understood exactly how much they were risking, yet climbed into their cars anyway. Looking back now, there are five names that have never left me. Every one of them changed the way I thought about racing. Every one of them left something behind that I carried for the rest of my life. Those are the men I want to tell you about today. Let me start with the man who, in many ways, defined what a complete racing driver looked like long before the rest of us understood the standard he had already set. When I first watched Juan Manuel Fangio, I wasn't thinking about championships or records. I was simply trying to understand how one man could make something so dangerous appear so effortless. There were plenty of fast drivers in those days. Every Formula One grid was filled with brave men willing to push a car beyond what seemed reasonable. Fangio was different. He never looked like he was wrestling the machine. It always seemed as though the car wanted to do exactly what he asked. That was the first lesson he taught me. Real control isn't dramatic, it's almost invisible. People often describe Fangio as the greatest because of his 5 world championships, but that isn't why I admired him. What impressed me most was his ability to understand a race before everyone else did. He wasn't simply driving against the men around him. He was reading the circuit, listening to the car, managing the tires, preserving the brakes, and thinking several laps ahead. By the time other drivers realized the race had changed, Fangio had already adapted. That kind of intelligence couldn't be measured by a stopwatch. The race that always comes back to me is the 1957 German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. Even years later, drivers still talked about it in the paddock. Fangio's Maserati lost precious time during a pit stop, leaving him nearly 50 seconds behind the Ferrari pair of Mike Hawthorne and Peter Collins. On most circuits, the race would have been over. At the Nürburgring, against 2 Ferraris running at full speed, it should have been impossible. Instead, Fangio produced one of the greatest drives Formula One has ever seen. Lap after lap, he broke the circuit record, not once but repeatedly. Every corner looked precise without ever appearing reckless. By the closing laps, he had erased an advantage that should never have disappeared. Then he overtook Collins and Hawthorne to win the race and secure another world championship. Drivers of my generation didn't remember that afternoon because Fangio won. We remembered it because it changed our understanding of what was possible inside a racing car. When I eventually reached Formula One with Ferrari, I found myself thinking about races differently because of him. I stopped believing that raw speed alone could decide championships. Preparation mattered. Mechanical sympathy mattered. Patience mattered. There were weekends when resisting the temptation to attack immediately became the smartest decision you could make, and I learned that partly by studying the way Fangio approached the sport. Off the circuit, he carried himself with the same quiet confidence. He never needed to convince anyone he was the best. His driving spoke loudly enough. In an era filled with enormous personalities and constant danger, there was something reassuring about a man who remained calm no matter how chaotic the situation became. I don't think any driver has ever completely matched the balance Fangio possessed. He combined speed, experience, discipline, and judgment in a way that felt almost impossible to replicate. Even after I became world champion myself in 1961, I never believed I had reached the level he represented. When people ask me who I admired most, Fangio's name always comes first. Not because he showed us how to win, because he showed us what true mastery of Formula One actually looked like. Now, this is where my list may surprise some people. If Juan Manuel Fangio represented perfection, then Stirling Moss represented possibility. He showed all of us that there wasn't just one way to be extraordinary. I first came to know Stirling during the years when Formula One was attracting some of the finest drivers in the world. Even among that remarkable company, he stood apart. You noticed it almost immediately. It wasn't because he was louder than everyone else or because he carried himself like a future champion. It was because he seemed capable of driving absolutely anything. Put him in a Formula One car, a sports car, a touring car, or even a rally car, and somehow he would find speed before anyone else had fully understood the machine. That kind of versatility earned my admiration long before either of us had accomplished everything we would in racing. People often introduce Stirling Moss as the greatest driver never to win the Formula One World Championship. I've always thought that description sells him short. It defines him by the one achievement he never collected instead of everything he actually accomplished. Those of us who raced against him never measured him that way. We knew exactly how dangerous he was every time his name appeared on the entry list. What made Stirling so difficult to understand was how naturally his speed arrived. There are drivers who attack every corner as though they're fighting the car. Stirling never seemed to fight anything. He adapted almost instantly. If the track changed, he changed with it. If the tires faded, he adjusted before most drivers even recognized the problem. If rain arrived halfway through a race, it almost felt as though the conditions had become an advantage rather than an obstacle. That ability couldn't be taught. One performance I always admired happened at Monaco in 1961. Driving for Lotus against the dominant Ferraris, Stirling produced what many still consider one of the finest victories of his career. The Lotus was lighter and more agile, but it lacked the outright power Ferrari possessed. Around Monaco, though, Stirling drove with extraordinary precision. Every lap looked measured. Every braking point was exactly where it needed to be. He spent nearly the entire afternoon keeping faster machinery behind him through intelligence, confidence, and an almost flawless understanding of the circuit. Watching that race reminded me that Formula One has never been won by horsepower alone. There was another reason I admired him, and it had nothing to do with lap times. Stirling genuinely loved racing. You could see it in the way he spoke about cars, in the excitement he carried from one event to another, and in the respect he showed competitors. He wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't building a public image. He simply wanted to race, whether the event counted toward a world championship or not. That passion was contagious. It reminded all of us why we had chosen such a dangerous profession in the first place. Before contracts became enormous and Formula One grew into a global business, men like Stirling raced because they couldn't imagine doing anything else. That spirit defined an entire generation. I often wondered how many championships he might have won if circumstances had been only slightly different. But history isn't always fair, and neither is motor racing. Championships depend on timing, reliability, and sometimes nothing more than fortune. Admiration doesn't. To me, Stirling Moss never needed a world championship to prove who he was. His career proved something far more important. Greatness isn't always measured by the titles you win. Sometimes it's measured by the respect you earn from every driver who ever had to race against you. Then there was Wolfgang von Trips. This is the hardest name for me to talk about because when I think of Wolfgang, I don't immediately remember lap times or championship standings. I remember the man. I remember his smile in the Ferrari garage. I remember how naturally people were drawn to him. And I remember how quickly everything changed. When I joined Ferrari, competition inside the team was simply part of life. Enzo Ferrari expected every driver to fight for victories, regardless of the color of the car beside him. Wolfgang and I both understood that We were competing for the same world championship in 1961, but there was never bitterness between us. We respected each other because we knew exactly what it took to sit in those cars every Sunday. What I admired most about Wolfgang wasn't overwhelming speed. He was certainly fast enough to win races, but that wasn't what made him special. It was his composure. Some drivers carried pressure with them everywhere they went. You could see it in the paddock before qualifying had even begun. Wolfgang never seemed to let the moment become bigger than it needed to be. Whether we were preparing for Monaco, Spa, or Reims, he approached every weekend with the same quiet confidence. He trusted his preparation, trusted his instincts, and never tried to become someone he wasn't simply because the championship battle demanded it. That consistency made him an incredibly difficult teammate. Inside Ferrari, every piece of information mattered. Every adjustment to the car, every conversation with the engineers, every qualifying lap became part of a much larger battle that stretched across an entire season. Wolfgang rarely made mistakes, and that meant you couldn't wait for him to defeat himself. If you wanted to beat him, you had to earn it on the circuit. By the time we arrived at Monza for the Italian Grand Prix in September 1961, the championship was reaching its defining moment. Wolfgang still had a mathematical chance to become world champion. So did I. Ferrari had dominated much of the season, and everyone understood that whichever one of us finished ahead would likely leave Italy in control of the title race. Instead, Formula One witnessed one of its darkest afternoons. On the second lap, Wolfgang's Ferrari made contact with Jim Clark's Lotus approaching the Parabolica. His car left the circuit, struck the barriers, and was thrown into the crowd. Wolfgang was killed instantly. 15 spectators also lost their lives in one of the worst tragedies the sport had ever experienced. The race continued. I drove on because that's what drivers were expected to do in those years. Communication was limited, and stopping simply wasn't part of the culture. I crossed the finish line first. A few hours later, I was told I had become Formula One world champion. People have asked me what it felt like to win the championship. The truth is, I never celebrated it. How could I? The man I had spent the entire season fighting had never come back to the paddock. Every photograph of me standing beside that championship trophy reminds me that someone who deserved to share that season was no longer there. Wolfgang taught me something I wish none of us had needed to learn. Formula One could give you everything you had ever dreamed of and take away something infinitely more valuable on the very same day. Even decades later, when people mention my world championship, my thoughts inevitably return to him before they return to myself. Some rivals push you to become faster. Some teammates help you become wiser. Wolfgang von Trips did both, and his absence became one of the greatest losses our sport has ever endured. Now, this is a different kind of admiration. Some drivers impressed me because of what they accomplished. Jim Clark impressed me because of how effortlessly he accomplished it. There are very few people in any sport who make extraordinary performances look completely ordinary. Jim was one of them. The first thing you noticed about Jim wasn't confidence or bravado. In fact, he was remarkably quiet, soft-spoken, almost shy. If you met him away from the circuit, you would never guess he possessed one of the greatest natural talents Formula One had ever seen. Then he put on a helmet. Suddenly, the quiet man disappeared, replaced by someone who seemed to understand a racing car in ways the rest of us couldn't quite explain. People often talk about speed as though it's simply a matter of courage. They imagine the fastest drivers are the ones willing to break the latest or carry the most speed into a corner. Watching Jim convinced me it was far more complicated than that. What made him exceptional wasn't aggression. It was precision. He rarely looked like he was forcing the car beyond its limits. Every steering input was smooth. Every correction was almost invisible. He had an uncanny ability to balance a Lotus right on the edge of adhesion without making it appear dramatic. While the rest of us were constantly managing the car's behavior, Jim often looked as though he and the machine shared the same instincts. That kind of harmony can't be manufactured. It simply exists in a handful of extraordinary athletes. The season that best demonstrated his brilliance was 1963. Driving the Lotus 25, Jim won 7 of the 10 World Championship races. He entered and secured his first Formula One title with remarkable authority. But statistics only tell part of the story. Those of us racing against him experienced something numbers can never fully capture. Weekend after weekend, you felt as though you had driven an excellent lap, only to discover Jim had quietly found another half second somewhere nobody else could see. He wasn't relying on superior bravery. He simply understood where the car wanted to be. That ability made him one of the most complete drivers I have ever witnessed. His talent extended well beyond Formula One. When he traveled to Indianapolis in 1965 and won the Indianapolis 500 driving for Lotus, he didn't just win one of America's greatest races. He helped change it forever. Rear-engine cars had already begun appearing, but Jim's victory confirmed that the future had arrived. American racing would never look the same again. As an American who loved every form of motor racing, I admired that tremendously. Jim didn't believe racing disciplines should be separated into different worlds. If there was a great race somewhere, he wanted to understand it, master it, and respect its traditions. That's something I always appreciated. What made Jim even more remarkable was that success never seemed to change him. Fame didn't make him arrogant. Championships didn't make him distant. He remained the same modest Scottish farmer who happened to possess an extraordinary gift behind the wheel. I sometimes wonder whether people fully appreciate just how rare drivers like Jim Clark really are. We remember the victories, the championships, and the records, but those of us fortunate enough to race alongside him remember something else. We remember the feeling. The feeling that no matter how well you drove that weekend, there was always a chance Jim would produce a lap that reminded everyone what pure talent actually looked like. I've raced against many outstanding drivers. Only a handful ever made me feel I was witnessing something that couldn't be taught. Jim Clark was one of them. And finally, there was Graham Hill. People who only know Formula One through statistics will remember Graham as a 2-time world champion, a 5-time winner at Monaco, and the only man to complete what we now call the Triple Crown of motorsport. Those achievements deserve every bit of recognition they receive. But they aren't the reason he earned my admiration. I admired Graham because he understood something many drivers never fully grasp. Being a racing driver wasn't just about driving quickly. It was about leading a team through uncertainty, disappointment, and pressure. Every mechanic, every engineer, every member of the garage looked toward the driver for confidence. Graham carried that responsibility as naturally as anyone I ever met. When we first raced against one another, his personality immediately stood out. Away from the cockpit, he loved making people laugh. He was witty, charming, and seemed capable of making even the most stressful race weekends feel a little lighter. If someone had walked through the paddock without knowing who the drivers were, they might never have guessed Graham was one of the fiercest competitors among us. That illusion disappeared the moment the visor came down. Once the race began, Graham became one of the most determined men on the circuit. He never gave away a position willingly. He understood racecraft as well as anyone of his generation, and he possessed an extraordinary ability to remain composed while everything around him was changing. Whether conditions shifted unexpectedly or mechanical problems threatened to ruin an afternoon, he rarely allowed frustration to dictate his decisions. That level of emotional control was something I respected enormously. One race that always reminds me of Graham's resilience is the 1968 Monaco Grand Prix. By then, Formula One had changed dramatically from the championship season I won in 1961. New cars, new rivals, and sadly far too many empty places in the paddock where old friends once stood. Graham arrived carrying not only the pressure of expectations, but also the emotional weight of losing Jim Clark only weeks earlier at Hockenheim. Many drivers would have struggled to focus under those circumstances. Graham responded the only way he knew how. He delivered another masterclass around Monaco's unforgiving streets, earning his 5th victory there and reinforcing why so many people began calling him Mr. Monaco. It wasn't simply another trophy. It was a demonstration of professionalism at a moment when the entire sport was grieving. Watching that from outside the cockpit reminded me that champions are often defined less by the days when everything goes right than by the days when nothing feels normal. I also admired the way Graham embraced every challenge motorsport offered. Formula One was never enough for him. He competed at Indianapolis. He raced endurance events. He constantly searched for new ways to test himself against different machinery and different competitors. That curiosity reflected the spirit of our era when the world's best drivers believed greatness wasn't confined to one championship. There was another quality I appreciated even more. Graham never allowed success to separate him from people. Mechanics enjoyed working with him. Journalists respected him. Younger drivers felt comfortable asking him questions. He understood that Formula One had always been built by teams of people, not by individuals standing alone on podiums. Looking back, I think Graham represented the complete professional. He possessed talent, courage, intelligence, humor, and an appreciation for everyone who helped make racing possible. Those qualities don't always appear beside a driver's name in the record books, but they're exactly why all these years later Graham Hill remains one of the men I admired most. Looking back now, I realize these 5 men admired racing in different ways, and that's exactly why I admired them. Juan Manuel Fangio showed me that mastery comes from patience as much as speed. Stirling Moss reminded me that a driver's legacy isn't defined only by championships, but by the respect he earns from everyone who shares the circuit with him. Wolfgang von Trips taught me that kindness and fierce competition can exist side by side, and that sometimes the greatest victories are forever linked to unbearable loss. Jim Clark revealed what pure, natural talent truly looks like, while Graham Hill proved that being a champion also means carrying the people around you through the hardest moments. If you ask me today whether I would choose a different era, my answer is no. Ours was a dangerous time. We lost too many remarkable drivers, far too young, and every season demanded a price that seems unimaginable now. But it was also an era filled with extraordinary people who loved this sport for all the right reasons. We raced because we couldn't imagine doing anything else. I was fortunate enough to become a world champion, but titles were never the greatest gift Formula One gave me. The greatest gift was the privilege of sharing the track with men like these. The trophies eventually found their place on a shelf. The newspaper headlines slowly disappeared. Even the roar of those magnificent engines faded into history. But admiration has a way of lasting much longer. Even now, when I close my eyes, I don't remember the finish lines first. I remember the drivers who made every lap worth racing,